Hi there, I'm Gwen again, and this is the third and final video introducing the Body of Consent Circle that I'm doing with Isabel Abbott, and also talking about the different aspects of that circle and the different things that we'll be exploring. The first video was about consent itself and the complexities of consent. The second video I talked about boundaries and the embodiment of our boundaries, the fluidity of our boundaries. And today I'm going to talk about trauma and how it intersects with consent and boundaries, and how the healing of all of these things can and does work together. So trauma, we often think of trauma as kind of big dramatic events. Trauma can be from chronic abuse, be that sexual or physical or psychological. Trauma can be from an acute traumatic experience like a singular rape, a singular um, uh, physical assault. It can be from a car crash. It can be from there's birth trauma, both for the born child and for the mother. There's you can have trauma or trauma symptoms from a surgery. We can, I mean, there's all kinds of specific things that we can that we can have trauma symptoms from, that people often associate with trauma. Like, these are big events. They're very specific. We can name them. Um, and there's that, right? Um, and and there's also intergenerational trauma, which is the trauma that is the trauma symptoms that are passed down through the generations by our mothers, our grandmothers, our fathers, our grandfathers, and were passed to them by their parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and culture and all of that. And what epigenetics has found is that there's actually a trauma marker that is passed down in our very DNA that it's mutable, so it can be switched or turned off, so to speak, healed, and until it is processed and healed and switched off, so to speak, it continues to be passed down through the generations. It was thought, up until epigenetics came on the scene, that intergenerational trauma was passed down purely environmentally. It was passed down purely because our ancestors had a traumatic experience. It affected the way they behaved, and that behavior then affected their children, which then affected their children, which then affected their children, right? So, so it was considered to be purely environmental until these markers were found in our DNA. So, which tells us it is both nature and nurture, right? Not only do the behaviors of those who have had traumatic experiences, who live with PTSD and and even not specified PTSD, but trauma symptoms, are then their behaviors do pass down and complicate the trauma that is then within our very DNA. And then we have our own traumatic experiences of living in the world, right? So what this means to me as a therapist and as a person who has both had my own lived experience of traumatic events, and who has family members who've also had traumatic events, that uh, that this is also intertwined, right? That we have environmental things that are impacting us, and that we have our lived experience, and that we have our very bodies that are impacting the way we are in the world and the way we feel in our own bodies. Statistically speaking, there has been a rise in female reproductive cancers. This includes breast cancer, ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, cervical cancer. Um, did I say ovarian cancer? I'm not sure. And also a rise in endometriosis. In the past 50-ish years, and really we've seen a bit of a spike in the last 30 or so. What that tells me, there's also been a rise in chronic pain and in autoimmune issues, specifically in women, more in women than in men. In men, their reproductive cancers, prostate cancers, testicular cancer have they're kind of a flat line. They don't really go up or down. It's just they're there, and they also the 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 occurrence of autoimmune issues is also kind of just a flat line. It might be just slightly elevated, but it's not as dramatic as what we are seeing happen in women's physical health. So we have all this trauma crap in our bodies, right? We live in a world where women aren't safe. We aren't safe to leave our homes, and that's a given. That's a fact, right? We're not even safe within our homes. Many women experience rape, physical abuse, mental abuse, emotional abuse, gaslighting, all of these things, even within their homes. And that lack of safety, not only is it a lack of sense of safety, but it is in fact an actual lack of real safety, also impacts our bodies and our health, and we have a triggered trauma response to that. So there's a very real mind-body connection here. There's been several studies about how our physical health affects our mental health, and for me, that's kind of a well, duh. When I'm sick, when I have the flu, of course I'm cranky, right? I mean, these are things that I think most of us who are logical thinkers can, knew these things, right? But there has been scientific research to prove what we knew. So that's a good thing, I guess. And that trauma specifically needs to be approached both somatically through the body and through our mind. Via talk therapy or creativity processes, or various different ways of doing that. There's also a reality that many people have found, that while they've done a lot of mind-body work to heal their trauma, to process trauma, to work through their trauma, that there's also a spiritual component that helps with that. And that spiritual component, is as varied as there are people. So it's not like there's one right religion or something. And spirituality isn't necessarily religion based anyways. So there's that aspect. And while all of that is true, the mind, body, spirit connection, there is a point in our processing of our trauma where our resilience truly grows and blossoms and kicks in. And when that happens, when that resilience kicks in, we start to have the agency to fight back. So it's no longer, not only have we processed and dealt with and felt through and shaken out, right, our own anger about what happened to us, right? We reach a point where now we're fucking pissed that this happens to anyone, and we fight back systemically. whatever that looks like. It can look like volunteering at a women's shelter. It can look like making donations to Planned Parenthood. It can look like um, 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 being an escort to a woman, for a woman, moving her outside of a domestic violence situation into a safe place. It can, it can look like a million different things. It can look like raising our daughters to have very healthy self-esteem and to be resilient and to be able to fight back themselves, right? So there's a million ways of what that fighting back looks like for ourselves, again, as varied as we are individually. How this all ties into consent and boundaries is that often, in fact, I would say every time, although I really hate to speak in absolutes, a traumatic event is something that happens against our will. We have not given permission for it to happen. Either we have not given permission because we are unable to give permission. For example, we're too young, right? In the cases of child abuse, child molestation, all the horrible child neglect, right? All of these things, all of these horrible things that can and do happen to children and have happened to many of us, right? So there was we were powerless to give permission, and we were powerless to say no. There's those sort of situations where this ties into our consent being disregarded because our consent didn't even exist, or we didn't understand that it existed. In cases of rape and physical abuse, as we become adolescents and adults, again, right, our consent disregarded. Whether or not we physically fought back isn't relevant. Whether or not we screamed no, not relevant. Whether or not we laid there and just went out of our bodies and let whatever happened happen and had a hope that we would actually survive it, doesn't matter, right? Our consent was not regarded, and it was in fact disregarded and trampled over. Consent, as I've already talked about both in both the two previous videos, is directly tied to our boundaries, right? Because not only is our consent and our boundaries disregarded by the outside world, they're disregarded by ourselves, right? This is where trauma comes in. Because trauma, not only are we raised in a culture where we are told to be outside our bodies, trauma then kicks us out. We become very disembodied. We become very disengaged with our physical self, and that is it is a trauma response, and it is a survival mechanism. It is how our mind allows us to stay semi-sane through the traumatic event and after the traumatic event. There is a sense that if we don't leave our body, it's whatever we are experiencing is going to be so overwhelming that our minds will fracture. And if there is anything that our minds want to do, it is to stay intact. It is incredibly hard to have a psychotic break. These things do happen, obviously, but our mind will truly do everything in its power to prevent that from happening. Which is where the disassociation comes from, right? It's where the disembodiment comes from, because that's part of our mind trying to keep us mentally safe. It's trying to keep itself safe. And it works. It works really well, actually. So it's kind of a brilliant survival technique, except that we get stuck. We get stuck there. We get stuck out of our bodies. We get stuck in disassociation. We get stuck wrapped up in either the story and the memory of the events, and they whirl and whirl and whirl in our minds, or because we remember them, or we've stuffed them back so far that we don't remember them at all and we can't see them. Consciously, we can't see them. The issue is our body knows. Our body is fully aware of everything that happens to it. Our body doesn't really give a shit what our mind says we can or cannot feel or process, because our body's going to feel it. As I talked about in the first video about consent, is about the surgery that I had and how I had a traumatic response to that. My body went into trauma symptoms immediately afterwards. And even though it was a conscious, my brain, I was fully aware of what was going on. I knew that I wanted to do this. I knew this was actually good for me and good for my body long run. And my body didn't really give a shit, right? It knew it was being cut open and parts of it were being taken out, right? That's fucking terrifying. And my body knew. That's terrifying. That's not okay. This is not how this is not how we survive, right? By letting people freeze us, cut us open, and freeze our muscles, cut us open, and rip out pieces of us, right? Except often that is how we survive, as we know. For cancer surgery, if as one example. And, right, so our body holds all these memories within it. We do not give permission to our body to do that or not do that. Our body does it. Right? It is not about us giving consent for our body to have the muscle memory, the cellular memory of our ancestors, the DNA memory. Like, none of that is for us to say yes or no to. It is. It is what it is, right? Where we have choice, where we have consent, is in whether or not we say yes or no to processing, and to acknowledging, and to feeling all of the shit that is going on in us. This relates to connecting to our boundaries, right? Because we have a very physical sense of our boundaries, whether those are emotional boundaries that are being crossed or actual physical ones. We have a physical bodily response to our boundaries. The more of our trauma healing work that we do, the more of the processing that we do, both of our own lived experience and that of our ancestors, right, that's been passed down, the more we are able to connect to our boundaries, and actually the calmer our body will become. This doesn't mean that our chronic pain disappears. Right. This doesn't mean that all of a sudden we will never have another anxiety attack in our lives, right? It doesn't mean that depression is then forever shut out the door, right? It doesn't mean, that we don't feel uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that everything is rainbows and sunshine and unicorns, because life is not rainbows and sunshine and unicorns. And because we live in a culture that will continually traumatize us, particularly as women, more so depending on the color of our skin, more so depending on if we are transgender or non-binary, more so, right? There are levels of this, what I call patriarchal wounding, oppression, and traumatization, quite frankly. And while there are levels, all women experience it. And so as we're doing this healing, we are also being re-traumatized by our culture over and over again. So part of our resilience, or maybe even all of our resilience, is about learning how to stay present, to heal the trauma we can, to process the trauma we can, to be in our bodies, to come back home to our bodies, and be able to sit in the discomfort of being in a world where we aren't actually safe, and still using our voice. and not disassociating and staying here, right? This is not something that happens overnight. It is likely not something that will happen in 6 months, although the hope is there will be many shifts within the circle that we will all see and be witness to and experience ourselves. Um, this is lifelong work. The hope is always, for me personally, that the more of the work I do, the less work my daughter will have to do, and the less work my son will have to do. Because while, yes, this impacts women significantly more than men, it affects men too, right? We're all in this together. And then the hope, of course, being that any grandchildren or the generation of my grandchildren will have even less work to do, right, as we continue this. And at some point, we will completely tear down our fucked up patriarchal culture, and that'll be that. I may or may not see that in my lifetime. Doesn't really matter to me. I still have to do my part of the work, right? So that was just kind of a very broad brush little snippet of how trauma informs this work on consent and boundaries, how we are going to kind of touch, not kind of, how we are going to touch on trauma. There will be very specific trauma healing exercises that I will be offering to the group, and 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 just group processing in general. So we would love, Isabel and I both would absolutely love for you to join us in Body of Consent. It begins on February 1st. Again, the link is there. If this is in YouTube, you're seeing this, it's there in the description. If you're watching this on my website, it's there underneath the little embedded video. So I'd love to have you join us. Okay. And thank you for watching these. It's been fun. Mwah.